Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice lunch break. I'm delighted to say we've got Steve New now running the next session on artificial intelligence. So, Steve, over to you.
Okay, I'm assuming you can see my screen okay. Everybody, is that right?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. So, well, hello, everybody. I'm very delighted for my colleague Richard to ask me to join you today. What I'm going to do is run through some ideas about AI in teaching and assessment that we've been struggling with here for a while. I haven't got all the answers for everybody, but I hope the discussion will be interesting enough to help you on your own way, on your own journey through this. You'll note I've got a newspaper article on the my title slide, which says Oxford encourages students to use AI when writing essays, but that it's slightly fuzzy. And I'll come back to the idea of why it's fuzzy in a moment. But this headline actually comes from an article in the Daily Telegraph, where I suddenly found myself in December on the front page of the Telegraph, and indeed mentioned on the Today programme on the radio in the UK, because of my encouragement for students to use AI as they're writing their undergraduate tutorial essays. And I'll explain what that involves in a moment. But the position where we've got to here is that for formative assessment and for formative work, AI is incredibly valuable. For summative assessment, where we're using assessment, for example, to award degrees, it's a lot more complicated, and I'll try and explain some of the reasons why it's more complicated as we go through. Now, AI is worrying for us in a number of ways, and it's worrying because it presents several multi-faceted challenges to us as educators. And one type of challenge that we're going to be facing in the future is summed up by this this chap here.
Well, hello there. This isn't me, but an artificial intelligence generated version of me. And I'm able to speak just like Steve New, but I will read out any old tosh that someone types in. Freaky, eh? And so I can say all sorts of tripe. And old Steve, that old duffer, doesn't even need to know.
So the rather alarming thing about that video for me is that this was generated through a thing called HeyGen, and this is the free version, and it's based on 2 minutes of training data. If you pay for the non-free version, you can train it on an hour of data, and then it would get my voice right as well. And then I don't think anyone other than people who know me extremely well would be able to tell the difference between the AI version of me and that version of me, that text-driven version of me. And so that's all part of this discussion about AI in teaching and assessment is connected to do with what AI does with the notion of truth. And there's this guy, Elliot Higgins, you may have come across, who's a journalist, a founder of a great organization called Bellingcat. And there was a quote from him I came across a while ago that I think is extremely provocative. The true threat of AI-generated content is not that it will convince us to believe things that aren't true. It's that ... Now, I'll just give you a moment's pause to think what you think might come after that, how he's going to conclude that sentence. The true threat of AI-generated content is not that it will convince us to believe things that aren't true. It's that we won't believe anything unless it reinforces what we already think is true. So this is a question about the way, once we lose the anchor for knowing what's true and not true, we'll believe anything as long as it reinforces our prejudices. And in fact, it goes on to add onto that, or another risk is that we'll disengage completely because the truth will seem impossible to find. Now, as educators, I think understanding what this strange revolution is doing to our students and their comprehension of the idea of truth is a really important part of this sort of discussion. Now, I hope you'll forgive me for a few moments. I won't take long on this, but what I'm going to do is just take a quick diversion into talking about some of the technicalities of AI. Now, I do appreciate that for many of you on the call, I'm not going to tell you anything in the next couple of minutes that you don't know already, but I have discovered by doing quite a lot of executive education, really, talking to quite well-informed people, that there's quite a lot of confusion about AI, and particularly the types of AI we're dealing with right now, things like ChatGPT, for example, and so on. And so what I'm going to do is just try and explain in a way that I hope is helpful some of the background to this. And the interesting things I want to put it in context to say that we should think about AI as a kind of a Venn diagram, and there's the whole field of AI, of which the generative AI, things like ChatGPT and so forth, Claude, Gemini, are the large language models and the transformers. These are things within, these are a particular subset of artificial intelligence, and they're not the whole story. And I think a lot of our struggles in getting people to think intelligently about AI is because there's some confusion about what's going on in the box, as it were, what type of AI we're dealing with. So when I was a young man, I was in the beginning part of my career, I was doing a lot of software work and coding, and this was not this exact one, but a computer of this model, a PDP-1145, was what I was coding on, and I was writing conventional computer programs. And the sort of conventional computer programming, which many of us did when we were much younger, used languages like Fortran or COBOL, and what happens in traditional computing is you give the computer a set of instructions, a list of things to do, and it follows them rigorously, and you know exactly what it's doing, and you have to be incredibly precise about what you say, because the computer will do exactly what's in the code and nothing else. And so what's happening is the computer is following rules that have been deliberately inserted by the programmer. And you can make quite complicated programs in this fashion. So you could easily write a program that could play noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe, or even something complicated like chess. So when Garry Kasparov was beaten by the IBM program Deep Blue rather, about 15, 20 years ago, that was this sort of coding. So it's just setting in a set of rules, and what comes out of the computer is an answer. Now, you can extend that and make it cleverer by saying that the software can have a rule that will work out a rule. So it can, for example, look at a load of data and then look for patterns in it. So, for example, if you're doing credit scoring for car insurance, it can go through all the different demographic information and information about accidents and so forth, and it can update the rule itself. So here the output is, you get numbers out of this, but actually what the core thing is, the computer is generating its own algorithm, its own set of rules about how it's going to calculate things. And if you're really clever, then that sort of program can update itself continuously with new data. So a lot of things that up to about 3 or 4 years ago were called AI was basically this. It was people looking at large data sets and doing, under various labels, things like data mining and so forth, where you're trying to work out the best rule to apply to data to achieve some sort of objective. And a lot of AI remains like this. So there's an Oxford spin-out called Oxford Semantic Technologies, and this develops clever traditional sort of computing that looks at data sets that are unstructured and tries to work out semantic boxes to put things in, to classify data. And it does this through combinations of statistics and other sorts of logical inference. And it's a rule-based system that generates an algorithm that itself can then interpret things. So you can see here a schematic which I borrowed from the spin-out, where you're looking at buildings and trying to put them in different categories. So architectural structures as a kind of building, and the Shard is a type of a building, and that happens to be in London. And so you've got ideas of concepts which are linked together. So the important thing here is there's a structure which is within the program, and that's what the AI is doing. And so the AI has things like concepts which can be examined, and you can check that they're right. And you can use this sort of technology for all sorts of things. For example, image processing. you can look at data and you can construct clever rules, and programs which kind of work out rules to see, well, if I was looking at a CCTV footage of a cafe, who's a person, and if they move in a particular way, is that some kind of transaction? And this is developing a set of rules which can be stored within the computer. And in principle, you could ask the computer to tell you what the rule is that it's worked out. It might be very complicated, but you could get it to tell you. And of course, we know that there's lots of issues about bias and privacy and things related to this sort of technology. Oh, right. Now, there's been a bit of a rush, but that's important because that sets the stage for the important difference between that type of AI and the new type of AI. So things like ChatGPT, and the important thing to bear in mind with the new sort of AI that we're all using now is that it's entirely different. It's completely different to that traditional way of learning. And that's because this type of AI is based around a certain approach to a thing called neural nets. And the way to think about that is if you think about these nodes are all arrays up, and these nodes can have a value. For simplicity, say they're zeros and ones, and they're linked to each other by weights. And if you imagine the nodes in this first layer of a neural network representing the kind of input to a system, all these inputs are combined according to a set of weights here, W1 to W5, and they're fed into another node according to some rule, some threshold trigger rule, combined in some way. And if they reach a certain threshold, then that node turns from a 0 to a 1, for example. And all of these layers are interconnected with each other. And the important thing to bear in mind is you're talking about now a network of billions of nodes with trillions of interconnections. And this type of network means you could feed in some input and it will be turned into some kind of output through the weights and the linkages that interconnect all these nodes. So that's what's going on within things like ChatGPT. And what you're doing is you're saying, well, let's fiddle around with the weights until the input generates the output that we want. So, for example, for the sake of argument, let's show a picture of an apple to this network. And what we'll do is we'll have a very dull mathematical optimization algorithm, which will now tweak all the weights until you get the word apple out. And you could do the same in the other direction. You could feed in the word apple until you get a picture of an apple out in the end of the day. Or in the case of the things like ChatGPT, the LLMs, you feed in a sentence or part of a sentence, and until you get the output sentence that you want. So there's a process of feeding stuff into this machine, looking at the output, and then tweaking the weights until you get the output that's sensible. Now, if you train these vast networks of billions of nodes on vast amounts of data, I mean, unimaginable amounts of data, what's happening is it's acquiring a kind of an intuition about what's going enables it to guess what comes next. That's just represented by the weights, just by those W's in this calculation. There's nowhere where there's a rule being applied other than the weights. And in fact, because there's several ways you could finish a sentence, sometimes what it's doing is using a probabilistic mechanism to guess one out of many potential outcomes that it comes out of. So the important distinction of that's the way it works means that intrinsically, this new type of AI doesn't know anything. All it does is guess what's likely to come based on the vast amount of training data that it's looked at. And that means it hallucinates. And that means it may tell you things that are true, but it may well tell you things that are untrue, but it'll tell you things that are untrue that are kind of sound plausible. And that's the really distinctive thing about this type of AI. It's not telling you something that it knows. It's not looking anything up. It's just essentially saying, I've seen this pattern of zeros and ones before somewhere. I wonder what kind of thing I'm expecting to come next as a pattern of zeros and ones. It has no concepts and no interiority thinking about it. It's just a statistical guessing machine. And why this is important for us to understand is to understand the nature of the hallucinations that it gets. Now, When I joined Oxford nearly 30 years ago, I worked very closely with someone who became a very close friend, a legendary Oxford economist called Roger Van Noorden. And indeed, when sadly he died in 2010, I wrote his obituary in the Times, and he was recognized to be a marvelous person. And so if you ask, there's enough information about Roger that you can ask ChatGPT and the other AI programs about him, and it'll tell you interesting things about him. For example, here, this was a query from I did last year. I said, tell me about Roger Van Noorden, and it tells me he worked in Oxford for a long time. He was an inspirational teacher, and then it gives me a list of his publications. And there's two really interesting things about this list of publications. Firstly, it's entirely the type of article that Roger could have written, but I happen to know that he never wrote a single article in his entire academic career. Now, the funny thing is the type of articles that it's suggesting he wrote would be exactly the kind of thing he would be able to have written, but he never actually did. And here's the rub with this, is that I know that he never wrote any articles because I happen to know that because I knew him. But even if you ask other Oxford economists today about Roger Van Noorden, about whom they'll have vaguely heard, and said, this is his publication list, they would go, oh, yeah, it kind of makes sense. To tell the difference between a hallucination and the truth is very hard unless you're already an expert. And that's because this new sort of AI is deliberately devious in that it tells you things that are plausibly true, but not necessarily so. And that has one of the biggest impacts we can imagine on this, on our challenge as teachers, because this isn't just a bit wrong, it's wrong in a way which is really, really hard to detect unless you already know. Now, it turns out that some of the systems have got a bit better. So if I ask the same question again a bit later on, I get a slightly more accurate version. But the issue persists because this is a fundamental feature of this technology. It's not a bug. It's a intrinsic characteristic of it. And that's why many people have described these models as stochastic parrots. They're just parroting things they've learned, without understanding, and they do it with a degree of randomness. The science fiction writer Ted Chiang, in a famous New Yorker article, describes this technology as producing fuzzy JPEGs, which is why I had a fuzzy JPEG before. It's a picture of the world, but it's kind of wrong. It's been fuzzed out a bit, and it's not particularly accurate. And a very recent paper that came out last week, I think, summarizes it much better that by just saying this: what ChatGPT is bullshit. It's exactly like a bullshitter who's kind of having a go at guessing something, and they might be right, but it might be wrong, and it's you can't rely on what it says, and that makes it very difficult to use this new technology because it has what Ethan Mollick, a fantastic guy at Wharton Business School, who's written loads on this, has described as a jagged frontier. So if you imagine the dotted line here is tasks of equal difficulty. The AI is really good at some things that you'd be, surprisingly good at some things and surprisingly bad at others. And the difficulty is we don't know where that frontier is. I mentioned Ethan Mollick. He's just written this fantastic book, came out a few weeks ago, called Co-Intelligence, I strongly recommend. Well, let's just flip back to another threat, though, in a sense. Another funny story about Ethan Mollick is there's also a biography you can buy on Amazon of Ethan Mollick. Ethan didn't know anything about this. He was told by a friend about it. And this is some kind of postmodern joke. It's been generated by somebody. So this is an entire book. I think it's about 200 pages long, 214 pages. And it's just generated from AI from Ethan's Wharton Business School personal profile page. It basically is just 200 pages of regurgitating the same things in different ways, but it fills a 214-page book. Now, here's the tragedy. You don't know that that's a rubbish book like that, and it's entirely worthless until you've bought the book and read it. So you can't tell in advance that that is going to be the case. And this is one of the problems we are facing now, is the AI. Before we get to questions about students cheating and all the rest of it, the real challenge for us is the total degradation of knowledge. And unfortunately, this is happening, and this is a wave of crisis proportions. hitting us now. So we've got academic articles which are being generated from using GPT. So this is, reputable publishers like Elsevier, and you can sometimes, I don't know what this tells us about our refereeing processes, but here's one from a journal, I think from 2 weeks ago, and it begins with, certainly, here's a possible introduction for your topic. So you can kind of see where this has come from. So what does that leave us? What can we do with these new technology? Well, the one thing you could do is you could say is there's a spectrum of activities you can use this AI for of different risk. And so very low risk use of this generative AI is things like formatting text, or maybe even translating text or summarizing things. And you can do that. And it's the reason that's low risk is you can check it after you've done it. If you're using this stuff to generate new things, then there's a tremendous risk you may accidentally then plagiarize, because it's possible for the ALMs to regurgitate by accident the exact copy on which they were trained. So without knowing it, you could be plagiarizing. And then worse is it will just make stuff up. And it will make stuff up that probably you won't recognize as being made up, because if you're skillful or knowledgeable enough about an area to know that something was wrong, you wouldn't have needed to look it up in the first place. So that's the challenge of that. These slides will be available, and you can read this slide in more detail, with more discussion of that point. Now, let's get on to the teaching a bit of this, though. So one of the interesting things we need to separate out is the difference between formative and summative assessment. So summative is where it matters for someone's degree, or they're getting actual marks that count for something. And formative is purely just feedback for to help the student learn. And so a lot of the things I was concerned with first off when I came across this technology was the purely formative end of this, the Oxford tutorial stuff. Our students write loads of essays and they don't count for anything. It's just for the purpose of learning. Now, of course, most of the world has stuff which is in the block I've marked there as standard assessments. This is coursework, which does count towards stuff. And that's the really tricky area for these this technology for us. Now, one thing I've come to think about is that when thinking about the formative aspects of AI, using AI in formative feedback for students and so forth, is that you've got to look at the holistic picture. So it's not just thinking about, is this essay an example of cheating, but it's to think about the whole journey of how the student engages with the literature, the skills they bring to critiquing the literature, the interaction they have with the tutor, what feedback they get from the tutor, and then how the students respond to the feedback. All of that is part of the holistic system. And where we've got to here is for that teaching, for formative teaching, is to explicitly encourage students to use the AI, but with these provisos, not to look stuff up or to find stuff out, and not to generate text that's then handed in, but instead to expand their thinking. So to use the AI in a conversational way, which enables the AI to suggest stuff that wouldn't have occurred to the students in the first place. So, for example, one of the things you can do quite interestingly is you could write have a discussion about the distinction between David Tease's and Kathy Eisenhardt's approach to dynamic capabilities, and then you could say, well, what would Richard Rumelt say about this, or what would Foucault say about this? And the AI will indulge you by having a conversation about you. Now, you can't rely on what the AI says, but it may say some things that will lead you down a path of thinking that you otherwise would have missed. And that conversational Socratic use of the AI can be fantastically helpful for students to really think through subjects and ideas in a way they would otherwise miss. Now, other people in other places take a different view. So this is a ChatGPT policy from the University of Michigan I came across the other day. And here, what they're saying is, you don't use it at all for anything at all. It's completely prohibited. But for us, my position would be that you can't stop students using this in this way, So it's a kind of a pointless way of to try to do that. What we do need to do is provide guidance on how intelligently to use that work. So I realize I'm going to run out of time in a moment, so I'm going to run through some important questions. So if it's not just the case that the assignment, but it's the holistic process of the assignment, then it also relates to how we mark the assignment. So in other words, if we're asking students to write deeper essays by using the AI, then that means our marking and our engagement with the essay as educators has got to be commensurately higher as well. I think what we generally do, I'm sure it's true for my community, academic community, and for broader academic communities in management generally, is we often mark for proxy characteristics. You know, is it roughly in the right order? Does it kind of make sense? And those are things we're marking for in that sense are things that the LLMs can do very well themselves. The technology has the capability of making us cleverer, but it also has the capability of making us more stupid. And so in the educational literature, there's often it's now a dated, rather sexist definition of different sorts of students. In the literature, it's a Robert and a Susan, whereas Susan is a diligent student and a Robert is a pragmatic, instrumentalist, lazy student. And the difficulty is those different categories of students will use this technology differently. If you've got a great student, this AI can make them write brilliant work and think more deeply. If you're a lazy student, then you're just doing work that might have taken you a couple of hours in a few minutes. So that's the challenge. We need differential strategies for different types of students. The other thing is exactly how this is going to work out is probably going to depend very differently between different types of subject. So even within management studies, I think there's a very wide range of granularity of texture of knowledge, and how that's going to work, exactly how you do things may be different in different cases. Right, I'm coming to the end now, so let me just wrap up very quickly. In the last year or so, we've been experimenting very heavily by trying to encourage undergraduate students to use AI to write better essays and think very clearly about things. But what we've discovered is that once you've really explained how to use the AI to students, taught them all about how not to rely on it for truth and so forth, how to be cautious about how they use it, how to use it conversationally, people realize that that's a lot of work. In fact, this makes writing essays a harder thing than it was before. So we've discovered a kind of a reluctance amongst some students to actually explore the technology. And maybe that means we're setting too many pieces of work. Perhaps we need to give them longer runs at things so that they've got the opportunity to really dive in and make the best use of this technology. Where people do use it, what we've discovered is people are very reluctant to really do anything more than scratch the surface. It's a bit like the problem of Google searching, of people being, rather not very good at using Google for researching things because they just sit with the first page of results rather than digging more deeply. So we've got to do something about making sure students have enough time, and maybe we've got to have enough time to teach them by example about how to use this technology to augment cognition rather than quench it. And that then brings us back to us about what we do about our own busyness. And this is the sort of hanging note I'll leave for this discussion to take with you, is I think the AI technology is such a huge revolution for our teaching and indeed how civilizations think, that maybe we need to really prioritize this process of teaching students how to use this technology as being a much more important thing than we've done in the past. And maybe we need to reconfigure what it means to be a teacher in the first place. Right, now I've given that my best shot to get through a lot of material in a short period of time there. I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm not sure if we might have a minute or two for questions, but I'll hand over to you, Richard.
I'm not sure I'm in charge, but Rufus is. I think we should have a minute or two of questions or reflections. And also, please use the chat. We'll come back to this for the swap shop, which is going to be occurring in about 45 minutes or so. But I think that's a really good basis for conversation. So quick 1 or 2 responses. Is that fair, Rufus?
Yeah, that sounds great.
I'm going to abuse my control of the microphone. Eamon, yes, please.
Yeah, Steve, thank you. That was excellent. Many of the points you shared there, I've seen it all in the past 9, 12 months in terms of how students are engaging with it. I agree with you. Students are finding it's actually a lot of work. Do we need to even do this? Let's stick to what we've always done. But I'm finding, so students, anyone who does use it, they have to explain to me how they've used it.
Yeah.
So maybe up to 600 words, yeah? I do provide them with guidelines, but fundamentally, everything you write has to be in your own words. That's a key requirement, and you captured that quite well in your work. Lots of students are students who do use it. I'm finding they're using it for editing, to enhance presentation,
Sure.
this kind of thing, rather than to find knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think actually there's a if we were to say you can't use ChatGPT and all the others, Copilot and Gemini, etc., for that purpose, then we would also have to be getting rid of Word and Grammarly, because that's the same kind of approach to things. So I think the question. One thing I didn't say, I realized in my discussion, is there is no mechanism for detecting this. I mean, sometimes things crop up because people are stupid, but basically, there's no hard iron a reliable way of detecting this stuff. So ultimately, we're relying on students doing what they're told for these things. So we have to trust them to say, use it for this, but not for that. But it does mean that, of course, if someone does use it to generate, they're using it to generate the words, we've no way of knowing that. And that means for lots of our work, we've got to, change the fundamental basis of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Tina.
Yes, thank you very much. It was scary and, informative. So it has to be both. We go into the future the way it is. I do see that some small businesses are also just using it randomly.
Yeah.
I did experience the other day a very interesting one, and that was that it did citations.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
so
nice.
When LLMs provide citations, they're making up the citations. So you don't. It's not that they're actually drawing from citations; they're making it up. They just might be making it up quite cleverly. So they might get it right a lot of the time, but a lot of the time they will just fabricate it. And the risk is they will fabricate it in a way that you and I can't tell the difference unless we actually check.
Well, not even getting there that much, but I don't know, about 18 months ago, I participated for libraries. We're teaching librarians and elementary school teachers and high school teachers in the States. And if anybody wants that resource, I can get it to you. How to go through the process of creating art. The scariest domain. How will AI get creative, right? And, it was, so I think it's even different today, right?
I think,
How Steve, yes, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I don't try to speak across you, but that's the kind of example of the jagged frontier thing. So, if you wanted to take Richard Whittington's, glorious book, What is Strategy and Who Cares, or whatever it's called, and turn it into an extended rap song or iambic pentameters, it can do that at a drop of a hat, which, would be a big struggle for us, not least of which because we think it'd be pointless, but it can do that really well. But saying accurately something about Richard Whittington's work is a much harder gig, and for this technology, so it's quite tricky.
Yeah, that's a good thought. I know one of my students gave me a spoof essay deliberately, but my cleverest student last year, in a formative, essay, which he, in the last session of 8 weeks, he gave it in to me. It was a ChatGPT one, and the references were slightly out. And I just sent it back to him saying, unusually inaccurate, Oscar. Oh, shouldn't have said that. I just caught it only because I looked at the references carefully, knowing the student was good. But it was a privileged position that I'm in with small tutorial classes, not easy for everybody else. Steve, that was tremendous, both, as Tina said, frightening and inspiring. Thank you, and highly informative.